Was really excited when Mira asked me to come here and talk about my research in workplace dignity, and particularly my research in qualitative methods. And for me, being a qualitative researcher has been really a long path of discovery. And so this is kind of a coincidental title because I was asked to do a similar talk at the University of Nebraska a number of years ago. But as I sat down and thought about it, I realized that becoming a qualitative researcher, becoming a faculty member, and discovering new knowledge in a particular area, these are all paths. And so what I'm going to be talking about today when I talk about this qualitative path of discovery is the things that I've learned not only about my research in workplace dignity, and I'm going to highlight some studies and some findings of those, but also what I learned about being a qualitative researcher and what I learned about developing as a faculty member from grad student. So my path kind of began like this. I was a graduate student, like some of you in the room, and I'm sitting in front of a big table on the first day of orientation, and one of the advisors says, "What is your research interests?" And this was a new thing to me because I didn't know I was supposed to have research interests. So I didn't know what they were, but listening to other people, I knew that I was drawn to grad school because I was concerned about the issues of mistreatment of people that I worked with, and curiosity about how people who were regularly dismissed in organizations could stay motivated and continue to perform. And so even though I didn't know that I was studying workplace dignity, looking back, I saw this. So a couple years after I started my master's degree, I wrote a thesis, and the opening prologue of my thesis says, "My only hope is I present them," my participants here, "with as much integrity and dignity as they have lived their lives." The final sentence in my thesis, which is not on dignity, said, "Their battle is now one of gaining dignity and voice. A battle that will be won one round at a time with Sisu." Without knowing the context of the story, you can see that this is starting to appear. A couple years later, I wrote another research article with my advisor. We're working with blue-collar populations. I said, "Miners discursively construct a strong occupational culture that enables them to find dignity and meaning in their work despite outsiders' perceptions." 3 years later, another chapter said, "In this chapter, I give voice and name to a central aspect of membership in the working class as an effort to bolster a sense of dignity among its members." In 2009, doing a gendered analysis, I say, whereas blue-collar men have drawn upon the masculine nature of their respective organizations as a source of dignity, blue-collar women are faced with more complicated identity negotiations. My research interests were there all along. They were buried in what I was saying at the starts and ends of articles, and so I decided to pursue this path very explicitly. And so let me talk about some of the articles that have shaped this path. The first article that I published explicitly on workplace dignity was one that was eventually published in Management Communication Quarterly in 2011. What I had done was interviewed miners in a blue-collar community and their wives and their adult sons and adult daughters. In total, it was 25 family units, 60-some family members, and in it, I asked them the question specifically, what kinds of work do you think have the most dignity? The results of this seemed kind of simple at first. They said all jobs are important and valuable. They said dignity is located in the quality of the job performed. And dignity emerges from the way that people treat and are treated by others. But here's the really interesting thing about this. The interesting thing is they didn't say it like that. What they said was, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter if you're digging a ditch or if you're a lawyer. All jobs have the same amount of dignity if they're done right. It doesn't matter, and I will use their language, it doesn't matter if you're a shit shoveler or a CEO. All jobs are important and valuable. It's just that some get paid a little and some get paid a lot. And this is a really fascinating thing, to see this juxtaposition, not talking about themselves. They never talked about, here are the ways that my dignity is offended, but they talked about high-status outgroups, surgeons and lawyers and CEOs, and low-status outgroups, ditch diggers and shit shovelers and burger flippers. And they compared these two and said both of these are worthy of equal dignity. And what made this really fascinating is social comparison theory actually says that when people have a disadvantaged social identity, like a blue-collar miner, what they're supposed to do is look down on people beneath them and say, well, I'm better than these ditch diggers. Or they're supposed to look up at people above them and say, well, they don't understand me, and they're going to disparage the people who disparage them. But here they didn't do that. They didn't act the way that all theory says that they should do. Instead, they drew this comparison in this comfort zone where they didn't have to talk about their own injuries. So what I learned from this process is that you have to move, so this is qualitative research lesson number 1, you have to move beyond the red ones, blue ones, green ones phenomenon of data analysis. And this is something that I described, perhaps Cole has heard me describe this before. You have to move beyond, here's a cluster of things that are the same, here's another cluster, and you have to get to what the interesting pattern is. And you have to put that in conversation with theory. So that's what I learned in terms of analysis. But the second takeaway that I have from this is that you have to take advantage of all opportunities for data collection. Anybody in here planning on doing a qualitative dissertation? Yeah, so I knew, I could tell that I was moving towards studying dignity. And so when I was sitting down to interview people for my dissertation, which had to do with deindustrialization, I thought, when am I ever going to have 62 people that I can ask this question? So take advantage of those opportunities to collect data. The second study that I want to talk about is about the Foxconn Corporation. How many people have heard of Foxconn? All right, they are the electronics manufacturer that makes your Xboxes and your iPhones and the wires at U of L that plug your desktop computer to the internet. There's this great quote that says, someday we predict that everything in the world will be made at Foxconn and sold at Walmart. That was one of my favorite quotes I stumbled upon in this research. What happened with this study is I was teaching a graduate seminar in workplace dignity, and I had some graduate students who were really interested in this because they were from China. And what was happening in 2010, if you recall the news stories, is young migrant workers in their late teens and early 20s were committing suicide by jumping out of the windows of Foxconn factories. More than, I think it was 14 people within a span of 10 months had taken their lives, and there were also some failed attempts that left people permanently paralyzed. It was a devastating time, and the response to it from Foxconn, from Apple, from some of the other employers is, no, we totally support the dignity of workers. But reports coming out of Foxconn was that there was no dignity at all. So what we did is we did a case study, and I partnered with 2 grad students from China who were able to read Chinese language newspapers and do translations. We also did some analysis of some secret reports coming out, undercover investigative journalism, as well as some locally produced reports to examine through a workplace dignity framework. And what we found is, yes, every condition that sociologist Randy Hudson identified as harming dignity was evident here. They were overworked, often working 80 or more hours a week, often without being paid overtime. Mismanagement and abuse was rampant. When they would make mistakes, they would be called up in front of people and have to tell on themselves and report how badly they behaved. They were yelled at and they were struck. Incursions on autonomy ranged everything from requiring them to eat all of their food in the cafeteria, telling them what time they were allowed to go to bed, not allowing them to walk on the grass, to all kinds of little tiny incursions. And so one of the takeaways here is you have to chase the story. People really cared about this Foxconn story at that time. And so what we did is we did the analysis, we had this framework, we sent it off for review, and yet the reviewers said, it's an interesting case, but it's not interesting enough for publication. And the reason why is that there wasn't that theoretical connection. So what we did is we returned to look at what was theoretically happening, and what we found in all of this is that Goffman's idea of total institution exacerbated all of those conditions. So we brought in a framework of total institution, which is this idea that some organizations are 24/7 surveillance, right? So you live at the organization, you're controlled by the organization, you live in a batch lifestyle, so you eat together, you go to work together, you clock out together, you go to sleep together, and that these exacerbated the conditions. So for example, an overwork exacerbation is, if you could imagine, maybe you've all heard the story of Steve Jobs, and he didn't like the smudginess of the glass on the iPhone, and then he wanted this better glass, and so he says, oh, we need better glass. What happened at Foxconn is they went immediately, woke people out of bed, gave them a cup of tea, and sent them to their production line for 12 hours. Well, that wouldn't happen if you were sleeping in your own apartment off campus. So that would be a way that total control infiltrates. So again, the takeaways here is, one, sometimes you need to chase the story in the moment, but two, the story is not enough, it has to be connected to theory. The third study actually was initiated after the completion of the 2011 study, and let me just digress for a moment and say, because of publication, when things get published, what dates get attached to them, these are not necessarily in the chronological order that it might appear that they were published in. But in about 2008, I got a grant as a brand new young faculty member to do some data collection. So I used the money to conduct focus groups. I did focus groups with 60 individuals who worked a range of occupations, from people who assembled motorcycles to people who were morticians to financial planners, teachers, and guys who worked at pizza shops. And I talked to all these individuals and said, what does dignity mean to you? When was the time that you think that you had it, and when was the time you think that it was violated? The results from this study is that they said that their inherent dignity as a human being was recognized when people talked to them respectfully. They said that they wanted an opportunity to establish that they were worthy of additional merit and respect, and that came when they got messages that acknowledged their competence and the contribution they made to the organization. Things like telling somebody they did a job well. And third of all, that they realized that they worked in organizations that were marked by instrumentality and inequality, meaning that they were hired as a means into an end, and that relationship could be severed anytime there stopped being an economic benefit for the company. And they realized that organizations were also marked by deep inequality, so some people were always going to be more advantaged than others. But it wasn't instrumentality and inequality that violated their dignity. What it was messages that rubbed their face in it. So they were okay with those conditions. But when people pointed out that you're not worth as much because you're lower paid, I can get rid of you and you have to listen to me because you don't have better options, were the things that were seen as most deeply harmful for their dignity. This was an article that went through multiple revisions. So as a qualitative researcher, if this is something that you're thinking of pursuing, you are going to probably have more revision requests than if you're doing quantitative research. And one of the reasons why is because the data is rich and interesting and can only represent part of what's going on, and Amira, you can probably relate to this. Reviewers are going to jump in and reinterpret your results for you and say, maybe what you are really seeing is this, and have you considered that? So it's going to go through multiple iterations, and that's what happened here. I wrote it, rewrote it a third time. But one of the things that I learned here as a new researcher is that qualitative reviews really push themes harder than mixed methods would. So originally this was designed to build a scale, and this is going to be the front end of a mixed methods study. It ended up being a qualitative, straight up qualitative report, and they pushed me much, much harder. Whereas my original themes, which weren't that much different, likely would have stood in a mixed methods report. This really needed more theoretical substance. But my takeaway from this as a developing scholar is that you can't give up, because qualitative research is really hard. It's long, it's laborious, and very time consuming. One of the interesting things that came out of the study is, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier informally, is I was asked by the American Sociological Association to write a blog. So then I got to take my 13,000 word essay and distill it from academic language and theory into an 800 word piece that would be interesting to a general readership. And let me tell you, that was probably as hard to write as the 13,000 words. All right. The next study I conducted was one that I did with one of my graduate students from the University of Nebraska. So again, this is part of my development as a scholar, moving from somebody who was doing research with my advisor to research independently to then advising people who were doing their own qualitative research. She went in to do a dissertation examining the workplace dignity experiences of LGBTQ employees. And this was a really interesting and, again, time-consuming project. She interviewed over 35 LGBTQ individuals about their experiences with dignity. What were the things that affirmed their dignity? What are the things that violated dignity? And then she wrote up a dissertation that she successfully defended, and it was time for her and I to collaborate to write a piece that could then be publishable. And how many of you have worked with some of us have worked with advisors, so that can be a challenging process on both sides. So I got to see that the great work that advisors put in, which of course made me appreciate my own terrific advisor that much more. And what we found is that at first she was doing a little bit of that red ones, green ones, blue ones kind of analysis, where she's like, some people said this, and a lot of people said this, and a lot of people said that, but we weren't really getting to what was interesting. So we went back to the basics, and using qualitative data analysis software showed her how we could pull out just the answer to the first question, what does dignity mean to you, and look for recurring patterns. And the recurring pattern that occurred is every time an LGBTQ person said dignity, they said in some combination, safe to be me. So we went back, sensitized by the concept of safety and authenticity, and coded every passage that mentioned safety and authenticity. And that allowed us to do a sensitized analysis to what was occurring. And what we found in this article is that LGBT people said that their dignity was harmed with 4 specific categories of threats to their safety and security. There was social harm, the kind that occurred from social ostracism, from gay jokes and taunts, from abusive language launched on them by their peers. It occurred in autonomy violations, when people were just prying too much into business that would be very personal and never asked of somebody who was straight, including somebody whose boss took her to a strip club to prove that she was a lesbian. It came in the form of career harm, when people found that they were passed over for promotions, not considered for extra job responsibilities, maybe didn't get hired for particular positions, or were shoved into low power positions in organizations. And it also came in terms of physical harm, both real harm that was inflicted upon them and threats of harm. So there was a transgendered person who was really concerned about her safety. actually his safety, should he become pregnant because he was still physically able to carry the baby, and had a plan in place for how he would deflect that harm. Another person whose coworkers wouldn't support him after he came out of the police force was shot in the line of duty when people didn't go for backup. So they engaged in a range of dignity protection strategies. And so you can see all of their identity work and other things that they did were all designed around bolstering the safety and authenticity. So they avoided harm by seeking out safe spaces and avoiding dangerous ones. So figuring out what cities to live in, what employers were safe to apply to. They deflected harm with sexual identity management strategies, which include a range of passing and also coming out slowly after they tested the waters. They offset their identity devaluations by emphasizing their instrumental value. And they created, when they were safe enough, safe spaces for other people to express authenticity and dignity. And my takeaways from this is, yes, you have to dig deeper into that analysis. You have to find some kind of hook that unites your analysis together, your findings. But a second takeaway from this is to realize when you do qualitative research is that you have a really rich mountain of data that can be used for other things. And so my graduate student and I wrote a case study that is now part of a teaching book on organizational communication. And what we did is we pulled excerpts from many of these stories and blended them into a hybrid fictional character where people can discuss in the classroom how organizations might create better cultures of dignity for their employees. So it's a really great opportunity to make that connection back to teaching. And so that takes me to the current study. And I'm going to set this up a little bit and then turn it over to my colleague here. I was sitting one day at a brand new university, University of Louisville, with a colleague who was straight up quantitative researcher. In fact, more of a mathematical modeling kind of person with an engineering background. And I said, hey, you know numbers. Maybe you can help me through some data. And we had a really fascinating opportunity to work with a data set that is a qualitative, quantitative, qualitative type analysis. So in the late 1990s and then extending into the early 2000s, Randy Hudson, who was a sociologist at Ohio State University, got a NSF grant to content code more than 200 English language book-length ethnographies. And what he did is established a huge list of variables related to the sociology of work, and each one of these ethnographies was then coded. How many employees? What is the gender breakdown of the workforce? Is there abusive supervision? Do they have autonomy? Went through a whole bunch. And he eventually wrote this book called Dignity at Work. And in it, he identifies 4 basic conditions of dignity: overwork, mismanagement, and abuse, paradoxes of participation and incursions on autonomy. But when you read this much closer, you realize that he doesn't actually talk about dignity. He doesn't define dignity very well, other than a couple passing sentences in the first chapter. And in fact, in follow-up articles, he actually says, no, dignity is kind of an umbrella term for good work. So he never really defines dignity. At roughly the same time, Sharon Bolton, over in the UK, was writing a book and several other works on the dimensions of dignity at work. And she was kind of laying out this theory that was saying there's subjective dimensions of dignity and objective dimensions of dignity. And if we think about these as 2 different things, we might be able to see more about what's happening in the workplace. But here's the thing, she never tested it. So now we have this great opportunity because Hodson never defines dignity. Even though there's hundreds of variables, not a single one is dignity. And in all the articles that he writes that have the word dignity in it, every single one, he uses a different combination of variables. And then we have Bolton, who has a whole bunch of variables, or a whole bunch of theory, but no data. So we put those in conversation with each other. And I was joined by a couple colleagues who had quantitative expertise. I would lay out the model, they would run the numbers. Then we found some really interesting findings and needed to resort to a qualitative reimmersion. And that's when Cole joined the team. So I'm going to let him talk about what he did from a qualitative standpoint.
Thanks. You didn't get a handout, would you like?
Sure.
So my name is Cole Kreider. I'm a PhD student over in the business school in entrepreneurship. And Dr. Lucas was kind enough to include me on this study. Actually, before I go to the QCA stuff, so what we found that was unexpected was the relationship with autonomy and dignity. And what we'd expect is for the higher level of autonomy to be related with a higher level of dignity. But we saw in the analysis we did was that autonomy was actually negatively related with dignity, which is odd and is against what the research would suggest. And so what we ended up doing was something called QCA. And what I'm going to do is talk just briefly about QCA and then a little bit about the way we incorporated it in our analysis and then a couple of examples. QCA stands for Qualitative Comparative Analysis and is basically a hybrid from quantitative with qualitative. So instead of using correlations, QCA uses Boolean algebra truth tables, zeros and ones, where the condition in a case, in this Vessels cases, if a condition is present, it gets a 1. If a condition is not present, it gets a 0. And so what you're trying to find is a causal relationship through this 0 and 1 relationship, if that sort of makes sense. It was developed by Reagan out of UCLA, and Feist, I think his name is at USC, who's also a really prolific QC researcher as well. So what we did was created a much more complex table than this with all of our case IDs, and we were looking for when counterproductive workplace behaviors had interesting relationships. This is secure terms of employment and safe and healthy working conditions. The column you don't see here is autonomy is 1 in each of these 6 cases. And we're trying to find what is a causal relationship between a condition with the outcome of high counterproductive workplace behaviors and low counterproductive workplace behaviors, looking specifically at autonomy and what other mechanisms might be going on. And so here you can see when secure terms of employment is medium and safe and healthy working conditions is high, then we have counterproductive workplace behaviors being present. Also, when secure terms of employment is low, safe and healthy working conditions is medium, then we've got a lack of counterproductive workplace behaviors. So we saw this in the QCA analysis that we did, and then the next question is, okay, so what's really going on here? So I went back to the cases, and 3 examples that I want to mention. The first one is called On High Steel by Cherry. And it's a really interesting story about a guy who works with a steel company, and there's all sorts of situations when counterproductive workplace behaviors could occur, but they don't. And so the question is, well, why? And the reason is because there's no secure terms of employment. It's one of those, if you're familiar with unions, where those in the union have first dibs in any kind of job opening, and those without being in the union don't. And this gentleman was not in a union, and so he had managers tell him, listen, if you mess up or something like that, you're going to be fired immediately. Also, the secure terms of employment, this is a situation where if you mess up or do something incorrectly, you can get either yourself or a coworker killed rather easily. And so you see a lack of counterproductive workplace behaviors. Another example is called Dishing It Out. And this was a really entertaining story about some waitresses up in the Northeast. And it was a restaurant chain that was not very desirable to work for. Low wages, it was open 24 hours, and the clientele wasn't all that great. But what they had was high levels of autonomy, and they had a high level of secure terms of employment, so much so that waitresses would show up late, they wouldn't show up at all. One waitress stole from the cash register and was rehired 3 weeks later. So you have these different scenarios where tremendous amounts of autonomy and secure terms of employment lead to counterproductive workplace behaviors. So the last example that we show in the paper is called Rivethead, which is a really funny story as well if you ever had a chance to read it. It was probably my favorite out of all the ones that I read. And basically it's about a gentleman who works for GM. He's on the assembly line. And it's sort of a monotonous job. You get the idea through the story that it's not very interesting. And so they invent these different games to make the time pass a little bit more easily. And so they play rivet hockey, they do what they call doubling up, which is when one person does the job of two people, the other one can relax or drink or smoke or do things like that. And it's interesting in the story because the manager that they had during all these different kinds of actions said, as long as you get your work done, that's fine. Just get the work done, meet the quota, do whatever you want to do other than that. Well, they have a change in management. You see someone come in who's much more by the book. No, we're not going to do anything except for what we were told to do, etc. And this lasts for maybe a day or two. And then all of a sudden you see broken parts coming down the line. You see guns being broken, like nail guns, things that they would use. And there's this reaction to their autonomy being taken away. And so you have a really interesting relationship between counterproductive workplace behaviors and autonomy, looking at the conditions of secure terms of employment and safe and healthy working conditions. So it was a fun project to be a part of. And the QCA, one thing I really was interested in learning with QCA was it's very contextual. So you're not looking at how to control for certain things to highlight or pinpoint a certain mechanism. You're looking at mechanisms within a specific context or organization or culture. And the idea is that the condition is wrapped up in whatever kind of culture or context they're in. So you can't really separate it. It's a much more holistic approach. So that was one of the reasons that I really enjoyed QCA. And I think the learning outcome I have from all of this is especially the more intimate you become with the data, the more you see in it. And hopefully see stuff that's actually there, not something you're just assuming or hoping is there, but something that really is there. So if there are questions, I'd be happy to answer some questions afterwards. At the moment, I'm going to hand it back over to Dr. Lucas.
All right, so this brings us to the concluding slide, which is where we are now along this path. And I like this image. I think it's a great representation of qualitative research because being a qualitative researcher is a long and circuitous path. It is certainly not the quickest path from point A to point B, and that means that you have to get comfortable with the long haul. You have to get comfortable with really long data collections that might take weeks or months or even sometimes years to complete. With qualitative data analyses where you're just raking through piles and piles of qualitative data, sometimes thousands of documents to reach your conclusions. What I think is also interesting about this is that we see some fellow travelers along the path, but it is not a jam-packed superhighway that you would have with quantitative research, the fastest way from point A to point B. There's fewer people on this path. So if you are going into a faculty position or continuing into a faculty position on a qualitative path, you have to realize that you're going to be alone much of the time. Your colleagues may not be joining you. They may not understand where you're going. So it's important to be kind to your fellow travelers, to look out, put signposts out, to help other people find their way, to look for other signposts that people have left, to welcome people into your journey, like I've recruited Cole, partially into my journey, because it is a long process. So that's why groups like this are also really important, because you need to identify who those fellow travelers are. But the path is is an interesting one, and I think it's one that's very worthwhile to follow. It's enabled me to carve out a very specific research agenda. No, there's not 20 articles or 30 articles that I've written on this topic over the years. They've been slow, they've been a couple years apart, but I think that it's made important incremental contributions to understanding workplace dignity. I think that it's also helped me sharpen my skills analytically and as a writer, and it's established for me really interesting and positive collaborative research relationships with others. So, with that, we'd like to open up for questions.
I think we could give her Infer and call it the ground. Okay, one of the questions that I was very curious about is when we set up this talk and we were so excited to have Dr. Lucas and Qualitative Cole as well as a part of the team was, but how do you have these graduate student faculty partnerships and how do you make that work? And what is your experience? Like, what do you say are some benefits and some challenges to try and fit working with research projects and coursework and everything?
Well, for me, it's been all benefits. I think qualitative is really interesting as far as just a whole methodology. It really incorporates the story and the context, which I find extremely interesting looking at data. So I've really enjoyed learning qualitative methods. I really think it's been all benefits. I can't think of one thing that Dr. Lucas has been extremely kind with is trying to find my interests and where they overlap with hers. And so the dignity piece is really interesting. The entrepreneurial passion piece was great because that's right in line with
That's
what
another
we're
study
saying.
that we just.
Yeah, it's another paper. And so she's been very gracious in finding those overlaps with me. So it's been really easy in that regard, especially. But I'm not sure if that really helps.
Yeah,
much.
that does help because I know we have a bit of a mix of students, faculty in the room, so that's helpful.
I was curious, about the fuzzy set analysis. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I'm sorry I didn't do a very good job explaining. So the whole idea, more broadly or more specifically, what do you?
More specifically, I'm not very familiar with it, so
Okay.
as if I weren't familiar with it,
Yeah,
tell me about your experience with it.
So it is to find specific cause and effect relationships. And one thing I really like about fuzzy set is it doesn't assume there's just one cause for a specific outcome, or even if you think of an outcome being D, A plus B plus C equals D. They have this thing called complex conjunctural causality, and with the idea of you can drive an outcome multiple ways. So you could go through one path to get to the outcome, or through another path to get to the outcome. And it can depend on the context, it can depend on the structure, various things to get to that outcome. And so what QCA tries to do is pinpoint those relationships that get to the specific outcome, if that sort of makes sense. So they call them recipes, which I mean, that works well, I guess, but there are multiple recipes to arrive at a specific outcome. Does it sort of?
Can I add a little bit to it?
Yeah.
So it requires, at first step, identifying and coding in a real simplified way different variables across qualitative cases. So if you have, what department are you in?
I'm in the College of Education and Higher Ed.
Okay, so if you have, for example, cases with different schools and you wanted to look at student outcomes, you would have your 20 schools or 100 schools, and then you might have coding on teacher empowerment, whatever the variables are that you're looking at or things that you might contribute, which could be coded anywhere from 0 to 1. And then you would apply this Boolean algebra to it, and it would kind of show you which combinations of those variables predict student learning. Right? Yeah. So it's a good way to seek those patterns in otherwise unwieldy cases.
So would you then suggest that those patterns need to be like too exhaustive, or or
Yeah, it does, very much. So, a couple of things. One is the assumption with QC is you're really intimate with the data. You know the data really, really well. You know the cases well, which is important because you're trying to identify these relationships within specific contexts. Second, the analysis you do, there's a specific software for it that you can find. It's in the handout. And you create basically these truth tables. And that helps with identifying the patterns because you do these crosstabs and it shows percentages. There's two, well, but there's two basic scores that you come up with, consistency and coverage. And consistency is the presence of the cause and the outcome over the cause without, the cases of the cause without the outcome. So you're doing these two scores, which helps you identify the specific patterns of relationships across cases.
And basically, I'm guessing that you need to have at least 80, but preferably 90%.
Yes, for consistency score especially, you need to really, so there's kind of a whole discussion on what the score needs to be. Olson and Weiss would recommend a 0.9 threshold would be ideal. Anything over 0.9, you're pretty much, you can make the argument for over 0.8, but then you're kind of in a gray area.
So is, in entrepreneurship specifically, a couple of students, is qualitative research very widely done?
Not widely done, more so in the UK. There's a lady, her name is, I think it's a white lady, who does a lot of qualitative research in entrepreneurship. And then Carton, who did a whole passion scale stuff, that's an AMJ paper, or her theory of manual pattern. She did some, she's done qualitative research in entrepreneurship.
Her
Right.
coworker.
Right, the one she's published with.
Midness.
Yeah. But Carton basically created an entrepreneurial passion scale and then has subsequently tested it, and she's a qualitative. But it's not widely done, but it's becoming more prevalent.
But so it's something that you can see yourself doing in the future.
Absolutely. And I think, I really enjoy qualitative. I also like mixed methods, so I see kind of a combination of analyses.
So it's really wonderful. I'm sorry I had another meeting. I got here late. I will look into your research. It's very interesting to me. I'm the College of Education, Human Development, and qualitative researcher, and serving as the dean right now. Very important, I think, for our junior faculty and our doctoral students to understand the spectrum of research methodology, how important qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods studies are, and that really solid, high quality qualitative research can absolutely stand on its own and be very impactful, not generalizable, which quantitative
But
people tend to
transferable.
want.
I'm just having this conversation now, where did I go?
Yeah, exactly. So what's your advice to junior faculty or doctoral students who may be told, well, you better get on a research team with mixed methods scholars or quantitative scholars because it's going to be hard for you to get promoted and tenured, or you're not going to get funding. I mean, those are things that those of us in the field hear a lot. Can you speak to that and how you mentor folks, or how you will continue to help us promote the importance of the spectrum?
And I mean, and that's, well, I think probably the most important thing would be, if this is what you're passionate about, you have to find a place that supports you doing that kind of research. Preferably a place that has a senior scholar in a relative position of power who understands and appreciates and probably is a qualitative scholar him or herself. Because without that support in place, your research is going to be judged by quantitative standards. So they're going to look at the superhighway jam-packed with cars, 8 people on an article, and say, well, your colleague did 14 articles last year, or depending on what institution you're at. Your colleague did 4 or 5 articles last year, and you did 1. You're not being very productive without realizing that your data collection was not a survey that you set up, but it was one-on-one interviews that you spent 90 hours driving to, conducting the interviews and coming back, that you then did about 200 hours transcribing and verifying those transcripts, that you then went through each one and you did another 800 hours of coding, right? And so if there's not somebody who recognizes that, that's going to be difficult. It's also, you mentioned generalizable, right? And so I was just in a meeting with a colleague of mine who is not experienced in qualitative, who called me in and then said, but what's the hypothesis and how do you test the hypothesis? So you need to get confident in yourself and what it means to be a good qualitative researcher, because you need to be able to have those conversations where you say, we're not talking about generalizability, we're talking about transferability. And we're not talking about an absolute arbitrary number of whatever in terms of data collection, but we're talking about theoretical saturation. And you need to be able to define those and explain those and be confident in that. So yeah, finding support and being confident in yourself.
Thank you.
To add a comment to that, I also think it also depends on your discipline and also sometimes even which college you belong to in terms of how welcoming folks are or open about these different methodologies.
Right. Yeah, I went to, so I belong to the Academy of Management. I went to a pre-conference workshop on qualitative research, and they said you need to negotiate, and I don't think you can do this unless you have that great advocate in the department you're entering, but you need to negotiate up front that your numbers are going to look different than a quantitative researcher's numbers, that you're going to have different kinds of support for research. Yeah.
That's great. I have another question. It's kind of very in the minutia, so I
Oh,
don't
yeah.
know if this is. But you mentioned transcribing and then also checking your transcribing.
Mhm.
So when you do that, what's the sort of feedback that you get from your participants, and what is the process by which you transcribe? Do you transcribe every single thing that they say, or do you try to capture the salient points? Because I've had some feedback where they're like, I said too much and so this feels inaccurate or something.
Right, so I don't have them check their transcripts.
Oh, you don't?
I check their transcripts. So one of the things that will happen is as I'm transcribing, or if I shop it out to a professional transcriptionist, is sometimes some of the words will get messed up, or not will be added or omitted where it shouldn't be, right? So I will do another playback with a careful read on that transcript. One of the things that, one of the things that you asked is how carefully I transcribe. I am not a super careful transcriber in the sense that if somebody stutters on a word, I'm not going to capture the stutter. And if somebody speaks in ways that they are dropping the G on the ing, I'm singing, I'm not going to use stylized spellings. I will, with I will, if it's I might leave that out. If they give me a big long, here's my answer, then I'm going to include that. But if it just sounds like a disfluency, I leave that out. Sometimes I do interviews in coffee shops, and so sometimes we stop and talk to the waitress and say, yes, I would like a refill. I leave that out. So I kind of get more to the words that are said without all of the disfluency. And the reason why I do that is because for my purposes, I'm more interested in meaning than conversation analysis. If I was more of a conversation analysis type of analyst, qualitative analyst, I would do much more micro-level transcriptions. But I also wouldn't have 60 to 100 hours of interviews to transcribe either.
And so what's the rationale behind not sharing the transcript with your participants?
Nobody has ever asked me for them. There was one study that I did where I was interviewing old-timers who were underground iron ore miners, and their transcripts had some historical value to them. Those I transcribed and bound and gave as a gift and as for something for their family. between member checking. I don't always member check. I know that some people like member checking, and I think in some cases member checking is important. Some of the research that I've done, it hasn't really been, I have felt that I've gotten to my results without having to do member checking. I think that in cases, if there were doubts about how I was interpreting something, I think that that would be a time that I would go back, but so far, at least the studies that I have done, maybe I should be doing more member checking, but I just haven't really done a whole lot of that.
And you have your audio.
And I have my audio, right? I am really careful in terms of how I present the data as well, in terms of identity of the people participating. So sometimes I will change quotes a little bit if I feel they're revealing identifying information. So for example, one of the studies was interviewing people from my hometown. And there was somebody who revealed, and then I went to Montana to visit my aunt. And I thought, ooh, going to Montana to visit your aunt, that might be identifiable. So that got taken out. So we went out of town to visit family. Right, and so like sometimes if it's not substantively changing things but obscuring some private detail, so I will do that a little bit. But I have had, and maybe this is why I feel okay for not doing the member checks, but again, you're making me feel like I should, is I've had other people come and read my work without knowing who, so it's not going back to exact members, but it's going back to other people in the community who have said, this is so right on. So one of my best compliments ever in terms of scholarly work is my master's thesis. My grandmother kept a copy. This was the one where I interviewed the old timers. And guys with 8th grade and 10th grade educations went to her house and checked it out. She had like a library card in it and read it. And they said, oh, it's exactly right. She knew, just like out of the horse's mouth. And so I thought, well, you know, doesn't get much better than that.
And I should admit I'm a doctoral candidate, so I have a lot of very logistical questions.
Okay. Like, how do I do this? How far
How
along are you in data collection?
I haven't started collecting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, those transcriptions can take forever. Use Express Scribe if you're going to do it yourself.
Okay.
Do you have a qualitative data analysis software?
I use in Vivo.
Okay. I threw away in Vivo in 2006. Yes. What do you use?
This is specifically on workplace dignity, I
Uh-huh.
guess, but do you have any experience in educational dignity, how people who may have had some unfortunate experiences may affect their educational uptake, if you will, and how those things might be mitigated in a classroom?
So can you tell me a little bit more of what are you talking
So
about
I
from a
guess like the
student
question,
perspective,
yeah,
teacher
just
perspective?
student perspective, say a student has, bad experiences in school, being, looked down on, hurt emotionally, even physically in the learning environment. I guess kind of the question is how might that translate to their effectiveness in learning? And is there perhaps a way that these questions could be asked on an individual basis to help them learn?
Yeah. Well, I think number one, they absolutely can be asked. I haven't done it. I'm kind of going through my storehouse of, my mental Rolodex of articles, and I'm not sure of anybody who's looked at dignity. Well, and specifically, I look at workplace dignity. So I'm excluding things that are happening outside work context. So I think it's quite possible that there could be people studying dignity in education experiences, and these women around you are probably excellent sources to point you to that, since they're all in education, the College of Education. But what I would say is that my research says that people want three things. They want to be talked to respectfully, they want to be told when they've done a good job, and that they want their inequalities downplayed as much as possible. And so I think that would apply to students too. Like, I can't imagine how that wouldn't apply. And what Cole in my study found is that when people have less dignity, well, let me say when they have more dignity, they are more likely to be engaged in their work, so engaged in learning. And they're also, when they have more dignity, they're less likely, for the most part, to engage in counterproductive work behaviors or misbehavior. So again, if you apply that, if that translated to a school, you'd have more engaged students, less misbehavior, if they were talked to respectfully, complimented and appreciated for their competence and inequality standpoint. It makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I thought it was interesting when you talked first about your study with, the companies that were making, the Apple and those organizations, and you talked about workplace dignity in that context, and then when you looked at LGBTQ, folks who were talking about those experiences, especially when you talked about instrumentality and inequality. In a sense, I found similar patterns emerging in how you can see the connections between the experiences seem to be, the patterns of experience, especially when you have your dignity violated, depending on your identity in one way, in how you identify yourself as a person, versus, and in addition to what you bring to the workplace, in the cultures of the workplace, and also can add or exploit or violate dignity in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, you're kind of tapping into these two fundamental philosophical bases of dignity. So dignity from a philosophical standpoint would say, one, that everybody has an inherent equal human value. So just for the sake of being a human being, you have equal value to anybody else. But then there's sort of this earned dignity, so coming from this basis of dignity as sort of a badge of honor, something reserved for dignitaries, right? People with more dignity than others. That there should be opportunities in a workplace, even though it's instrumental, right, and unequal, to earn all of the dignity and worth that you have the capacity to earn, right? And so in that case, it's unequal, presumably equitable, but an unequal dignity. So those two, earned and inherent dignities, kind of fight in the workplace context.
That's really active.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'm working on a piece right now on social class differences, and it's a conceptual piece, but how social class differences plays out with two paths of dignity injury. So we have these material inequalities in organizations that disproportionately disadvantage working class people, and when they fall, those distributions fall below a dignity threshold, there's a direct violation of their dignity. But together, even when inequalities don't fall below thresholds, even when they meet or exceed basic thresholds, they collectively create a social class identity, which is then disparaged in the way we interact with each other in organizations, the way we put up firewalls to separate people from different classes, or faculty from staff, or whatever the case may be. That creates a different, more indirect path to dignity injury. I shared this with one of our staff members who asked me to read it, and he keeps telling me that's tough. That's the best thing. I keep a copy on my desk.
That would be interesting to study between faculty members and undergraduate students. Just what that experience is like, especially if you've been an employee elsewhere and then you come back and you're a graduate student, what that experience is
Right.
like.
Yeah, and I think that there's differences even in generations and generational expectations of what is dignified and respectful treatment, or